Alrighty, pushers, this is going to be a short video to finish up frame 11, Nixon's foreign policy. So last we left, we were talking about Vietnam and the slow de-escalation of U.S. presence in Vietnam, despite the Cambodian and the invasion of Laos. We did continue to withdraw U.S. troops from Vietnam. Final with the last of the more on Vietnam in just a minute, because it won't be till 1975 that we really will see the end to the Civil War. Okay, so in the meantime, before we get to 1975, let's look at Nixon's handling of the Middle East. So let's go back to the Arab-Israeli conflict. So let me take us back a little bit so that we can do a real quick recap of the events that led to the Middle Eastern troubles. So we all know that after World War I and World War II, the British had promised to give both Palestinians and Israelis a homeland. And the problem is that the British had promised the same piece of land to both the Palestinians and the Israelis. So after World War II, when they both sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, are like, all right, time to pay up, British, give us our homeland. The British are like, oops, and punted the ball over to the United Nations. The United Nations did a 6-week study to see about coming up with a resolution to this problem, and they came up with what is known as the two-state solution, so that they would basically turn what was formerly known as the British Mandate of Palestine into two states, the Palestinian state and the Israeli state. On the day before the two-state solution was set to go into motion, the Palestinians attacked the Israelis, and that led to the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict, the first Arab-Israeli conflict, ending in Israeli victory. All right, and remember, there is going to be a conflict in each decade. That was in the 1940s. Let's fast forward to the 1950s. The 1950s was the Suez Crisis. This is where Egypt kind of steps in, and Egypt is going to kind of be the leader of the Arab world, including the Palestinians. And so the Egyptians are going to close the Suez Canal to Israelis. The Israelis, in retaliation, will attack Egypt. War happens. It's called the Suez War, and the result is Israel wins. All right, Israel is now going to be in possession of some Palestinian land. But as a result of the Suez War, the Sinai, which was a part of Egypt, it's a peninsula that is a part of Egyptian territory, was demilitarized, and it was being patrolled by the UN. But then, in the 1960s, we have another situation in which the Egyptians remilitarized the Sinai and then closed the Straits of Aqaba. And when they did that, Israel then goes on the attack, and within 6 days, it's known as the 6-Day War, and within 6 days defeats the Egyptian, the Syrian, and the Jordanian military. And it was that 1960s 6-Day War that basically created a boundary in which Israel was in complete occupation of all Palestinian territory. All right, so now we're in the 1970s. In the 1970s, it's going to be called the Yom Kippur War. Okay, so let's go back to Egypt. Egypt, again, continues to be the leader of the Arab world. And the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, was determined to regain control of the Sinai Peninsula. Remember, they had lost all of this during the 6-Day War. So Anwar Sadat convinces Syria to join him in a surprise attack on Israel during Israel's most holy of holy days, Yom Kippur, a Day of Atonement. So the Israelis were indeed very surprised when the Egyptians and the Syrians attacked Israel on this holy of holy days. The war goes on for 3 weeks. It was also Yom Kippur, which is a Jewish holy day, also coincided with the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. All right, so the Israelis were indeed very surprised. More Israelis were killed in this war than in any of the 3 previous wars. So Israel, taken by surprise, appeals to President Nixon, saying, hey, we, Israel, need help from you, the United States, military aid, planes, tanks, other weapons. Nixon hesitates for a second, but decides, okay, yes, we will go on the side of Israel, and we will give them military aid. And as a result, Israel is going to successfully launch a counteroffensive, and they're going to take down the Egyptian and Syrian armies. And so then it looks pretty bad for the Arabs. At this point, because it looks bad for the Arabs, the Soviets start to support the Arab nations of Syria and Egypt, and it is during this 1970s Yom Kippur War that is the closest in terms of a proxy war between the Soviets and the United States, because we were supporting the Israelis and the Soviets were supporting the Arabs, and it looked like this could lead to a face-to-face conflict between the U.S. and the USSR. Both of our militaries were put on the highest alert. Because of this, Nixon is going to send Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, to negotiate a ceasefire in this Yom Kippur War. And so he does. He goes there, and he gets both sides to sit at the negotiation tables. Israel does agree to withdraw its forces from parts of the Sinai Peninsula, so Egypt kind of gets what it wants. And then preparations were made for an international peace conference to settle issues that are outstanding between the Arab and the Israeli conflict. This conference met only once and never met again. But peace was restored, at least temporarily. But bad blood, okay? Some really bad blood. The Arab world now has targeted the United States, as well as Western Europe, who also did help the Israelis in the Yom Kippur War. And the result is a couple of things. Now, remember, we talked in the 1960s, the formation of OPEC, the oil-producing nations, mostly made up of Arab nations. They decided to go ahead and place a boycott of oil against the United States and Western Europe in order to show support for the armies trying to destroy Israel. Arab petroleum producing nations imposed an oil embargo, a refusal to sell oil to the United States and Western Europe, those who are in support of Israel. The result, of course, is that gas prices in the United States went way up. Long lines at gas stations, gas shortages. And it made us realize, we are dependent on foreign oil. And this is probably a bad idea, considering the fact that we are now in support of Israel. So I'm going to give you an example of how the Arab world is starting to look to the United States and go, hey, bad guys. Muammar Gaddafi, he was the leader of Libya, a North African state who had remained in power in Libya for like 30 years. He stated, quote, "The time has come for us to deal America a strong slap in its cool, arrogant face." Saudi Arabian leaders commented, "And we're going to be rich." Right? So we start to see that the United States is starting to get a reputation of being being the bad guy here in the Arab world. So this is the famous Arab oil embargo that took place in October through January 1973 to 74. Along gas lines, you've probably heard, your grandparents or somebody talk about the Arab oil embargo. This is also going to contribute to an economic downturn in the 1970s known as stagflation. So we'll talk more about that in a little while, or next video. All right, so let's leave the Middle East for now. We'll be back in the Middle East in the 1980s, right? But let's leave the Middle East for now, and let's go to Latin America. So Nixon is going to issue what is known as the Nixon Doctrine, and I'm going to read you a quote from it, and you're going to see all the influences of all the things that went wrong under his administration here. All right, so the Nixon Doctrine. What is this doctrine, this policy that the Nixon administration is going to be at the heart of all its foreign policy decisions? Quote, "Its central thesis," this is the Nixon Doctrine, "is that the United States will participate in defense and development of allies and friends." So, yes, we will still help our allies and friends who want democracy, but that America cannot and will not conceive all the plans, design all the programs, and execute all the decisions, and undertake all the defense of the free nations of the world. We will help where it makes a real difference and is considered in our interest. So we will still be defenders of democracy, but we're not going to fight the war for you, right? That's the Nixon Doctrine. There are 3 key points of the Nixon Doctrine. First, negotiating with adversaries. Adversaries are our enemies. Yes, we will negotiate with our enemies, regardless of their philosophy of government. So even if you're communist, we will negotiate with you and attempt to find some common ground for agreement. So just because you're a communist nation, we're not going to pretend you don't exist. So no more pretending that the Soviets don't exist. No more pretending that the Chinese don't exist. We will negotiate with our adversaries. Second point, key factor in the Nixon Doctrine, working for a greater partnership with U.S. allies in which each nation is encouraged to make a greater contribution towards its own defense. We're not going to fight the war for you. There's not going to be another Vietnam. We will help you fight your own war, but we will not fight it for you. Number 3. And here's where even Eisenhower is going, because remember, Eisenhower's famous farewell address, he warns against the military-industrial complex. So number 3, preserving America's strategic strength for security. The U.S. maintains its arms as a bargaining chip, while attempting to reduce the overall level of strategic weapons among all nuclear nations and working towards universal control of weapons in space and on the ocean floor. So we're going to maintain our defense. We're going to continue to invest in weapons, and we're going to continue to research technology for defense. And so is the military-industrial complex all standing up and applauding right now? Yes, they are, right? So we're still going to maintain our strategic strength for defense and security. The stated goals were to promote democracy and economic development in non-aligned nations by providing aid. So if you're not aligned, meaning you're not a democracy, you're not a communist, you're just not decided yet, we will give you aid. But in practice, it supported many repressive, unpopular governments. So this is the era in which we enter, in which you might say, well, that's not new. You know, you're right, it isn't new, but it's now a doctrine, right? That's the difference. That we're going to support terrible dictatorships, right? Because they claim to be a democracy, but in truth they aren't, and that's okay because, we'll talk to adversaries. So in practice, it supported many repressive, unpopular governments. The U.S. furnished military and economic aid to any government that was pro-U.S. and anti-communist, even though it may not actually be. As long as they say they are, then we're good. So this is where, now you may say, well, we've done that before. I'm like, yes, we have. But now it's a policy. It's called the Nixon Doctrine, right? So I know, there's 2, 3, and now 4. I'm going to give you an example. The example I'm going to use in Latin America is Chile. So Chile was a democratic country, and it had elected in 1970 a socialist-leaning president by the name of Allende. Allende, intelligence said, had close connections to communist Cuba. And so when Allende was elected president of Chile in 1970, Nixon and Kissinger were like, he has ties to communist Cuba. And this could start what Eisenhower referred to as a domino effect. If one Caribbean or Latin American nation, in this case Latin American, goes to communism, then they all will fall. It will be a domino effect. So Nixon sent the CIA to prevent Allende from taking office. Now again, not new. Kennedy did it, right? We know that these kinds of things happened frequently, but now it's a policy, right? So initially the operation was a failure, but eventually the CIA supported a military dictator, a general in the Chilean military called Pinochet. So General Pinochet was able, in the chaos of preventing Allende from seeking office, General Pinochet seized power and took control of the executive branch of Chile, and then murdered Allende. And if you're thinking, hey, that sounds like Mexico, yeah. So Pinochet then instituted an oppressive government that jailed, tortured, and murdered his political opponents. But he was anti-communist. And so as a result, we're like, yay, Pinochet, even though you're a brutal dictator that kills your own people. Again, the Nixon Doctrine. All right, we'll go ahead and leave it at that. And then we are, I think, tomorrow moving on to, yes, domestic policy under Nixon. Stay safe, guys.